Hi YouTube, my name is Renee, and today I want to discuss with you something that is super important to me, and that is that question of what do we believe? In other words, what is your worldview? I am not here today to be a proponent of one worldview over another, other than to say that I think it's important to have a worldview and understand your worldview. I want to say that we all already have a worldview. We already know intuitively what it is we believe about the world around us, even if we don't quite understand the specifics of it. But so that we are all on the same page as to what I'll be discussing today, I want to read a few different definitions that I found while working on this video. The first one I want to read says this: worldview forms the context within which we organize and build our understanding of reality. That is to say, what we believe impacts not only the organizations we join, social groups, religious groups, all of those, but it also impacts our understanding of the world around us. Another definition that I think is very good to help us understand this a bit deeper is similar, but it says this: worldview refers generally to the cognitive, ethical, and perceptual frames of an individual. That is to say, it is how we think about the world, our cognitive functions, so how our brains work. I know that not everyone has the same cognitive function as anyone else, but our cognitive function does impact how we view the world around us. It also refers to our ethics. What do you believe about subjects like abortion? What do you believe about subjects like politics? Who should one vote for? What political party? What do you believe about guns? About all of these things. There are numerous different political and ethical questions we must answer. And then our perceptual frames of an individual. So how do we perceive one another? Our worldview impacts how we see those around us, our friends, our family, our relatives, those people who we go to social events with, people at school or work. Those are all impacted by our worldview. That is, we all have this worldview. It's not just something that Christians have. Christians might talk about their worldview more than other people, but everybody has a worldview, and it shows you how to interact with the world in a way that you find meaningful. I think so often when we are questioning faith and questioning if what we grew up believing is true, what we're truly doing is we are asking this question: is the worldview that was passed on to me by my parents, my teachers, my religious leaders accurate? Or are there things within this view I think might be wrong? Those are big questions, and questions that I'm not equipped to answer for you. What I can tell you is that if you work with other people and you also take some time to think about your own worldview, you might come to an answer. But I also think that as you're exploring your faith, or you're exploring, if you hear my cat in the background, she's playing. But if you explore what your worldview is, hold things slightly with an open hand. Don't just say, oh, that doesn't fit, so I'm going to ignore it. Because in the end, that'll just lead to more doubt. And I don't want you to doubt. I want you to be certain. So search and be willing to ask hard questions. I found a really interesting idea when I was doing some research, which basically says that the feelings of insecurity and distrust that you feel are stronger amongst people who least profess a belief, a faith, a religious idea, or a philosophical worldview. When looking at life satisfaction, psychologists in the study that is being referred to have found that having such beliefs increase well-being, provide a sense of life, meaning, feelings of hope and trust in a long-term perspective on life's woes, and a sense of belonging to a larger whole. So when we have a worldview, not saying what the worldview is at this point, when we have a worldview, we are more likely to be able to work with a community and have a better outlook on life, more rounded view of what we're experiencing, whether that's pain, sorrow, or that is you got a promotion at work, or a baby was born to your family, or you found out that somebody in your life is pregnant and expecting, or even if you found out that that person who was expecting suddenly lost a child. All of those things are impacted by your worldview because of what you believe. When trying to identify how our culture has impacted our worldview, it's important that even if we do not recognize where we are within a specific cultural context, that we understand that there is a cultural context behind what we're seeing, and that does impact our worldview. From a Christian perspective, that could mean that there are people in your life who are like, see this verse here? This verse means XYZ. But as one paper I read wrote, simply citing a chapter and verse for a moral statement being made or insisting that God has demanded it is not sufficient to make a Christian worldview. Worldview, especially Christian worldview, is one that is, I think, often, especially in Western culture, confusing. As Doss put it, worldview has three main intertwining dimensions: theological, philosophical, and cultural. Unfortunately, the cultural dimension is frequently omitted from the discussions of worldview. Some seem to think that a biblical worldview excludes culture. In reality, there is no non-cultural Christian worldview because there are no non-cultural Christians. There are only American Christians, or Indian Christians, or Korean Christians, or British Christians, or whatever group you're in, that type of Christian. Christianity always wears individual and cultural clothing. Throughout all of our talks of having a worldview, our culture impacts that so much. My culture is a culture that has historically been very conservative, has historically been very biblically solid, and my culture also is one that doesn't always seem the most flexible. I'm not saying it is that way, but that's part of what I grew up with. And throughout much of history as a whole, what we've seen is that much of what we consider American Christianity, I'm from America, has this problem where we try to syncretize God and what we believe about God to what we believe about politics. This morning, as I'm filming this, I was at church and we were talking about who do we believe that Jesus is? And we were talking mostly about a verse in Mark where Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter goes, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." But we see that the other disciples say, "Well, some people say you're John the Baptist. Some people say that you are Elijah or another prophet." And the question is, how do those fit? So what we see is that Christianity fits into the worldview that is there. And for the disciples, when they were talking to Jesus about who Jesus was, Peter's the one who got it right. But the other people were so involved with their worldview that they were adopting what the other people around them said because culture matters. The people in Jesus' day that Jesus was ministering to were from a Jewish background in the first century in the Middle East in Roman occupied Israel. Today, we live in the 21st century. We in the US live in a republic democracy, and we have our own worldview that's also shaped by our Judeo-Christian background as a country. That is to say, a lot of our morals were founded on biblical principles, but those biblical principles don't necessarily make up a worldview. As Doss also wrote later in his article, since Christians live in the creative tension that necessarily exists between culture and the Bible, syncretism is a constant danger. In fact, Christianity in every culture, whether long established or newly arrived, experiences syncretism in different ways. Doss did a case study where he was talking about two very different cultures. One culture was in Egypt, where when conflict arose, it was generally assumed that those who were causing the issue were women, while those who were right were the men. He was talking about how that could impact how one understands Christianity, especially as new believers. He was also talking about a study where he was talking to a young lady who grew up as a pastor's child within the Seventh-day Adventist faith. And she was talking about how every week her dad would ask her once she reached maturity if she was on her monthly cycle. He asked this because in their tradition, women who were on their cycle could not be involved in doing ministry. Both of these cultural things played a part in how they viewed the Bible and how they interacted with the world around them. That's not to say one was right or wrong, or that either were right or either were wrong, but it is to show that the culture you have does impact what's going on. So, some questions you should ask when you are working through the question of what is your worldview. The first one is an ontological question, which asks, what is? That is, what is reality, the way the world is structured, its functionality? What is physical reality instead of nothingness? Those questions are, what is? How do you define the world? How do you define the universe, the solar system? What makes up the material around us? What is? And once you have an idea of what is, so what you think is reality, is your reality that we're all living in the Matrix? Who am I to tell you that's wrong? That's not my reality, but that's something you have to question. So next you ask, where does it all come from? If you're living in the Matrix, it all comes from computer code. If you're living in a world that it's not the Matrix, where do the atoms come from that make up glass, water, silicone, paper, computer? Where do these come from? Why are things the way they are? Where did they come from, both the earth and our universe? That is, what is the explanation for it all? So after we have an explanation as to where does the world come from, the next question has to do with prediction. Where are we going? That is, what is the fate of the universe? What does the future hold? Is there more than one possible outcome? Is there an afterlife? These are things you need to think about. Is the world going to end in the next 5 years according to a calendar? Thinking back to when the Aztec calendar ended. Are we going to all die in a zombie apocalypse? Are we going to get nuked to death? So many questions. I don't know about you, but one of my favorite genres of media is like that post-apocalyptic storyline where people are like survived the catastrophic event that should have wiped out humanity but didn't. And those are fun, and that's a type of prediction. Within the Christian context, we have an understanding that the fate of the universe is tied directly to what God is doing and what the rest of the spiritual world is doing. And we look forward to a time where in the afterlife we are in heaven and there's a heaven and a hell. And that's also a prediction. The next question is one of what is good and evil? And I'm going to butcher this word because it's Latin and I do not do Latin, but I'll put it here, axology. That is, what should we strive for? Is there good and evil? And how do we deal with such things as morality, ethics, and aesthetics? I thought that was a really interesting one. So what is good versus evil? Within the Bible, we know that following God is good and doing things that are not of God are bad. But I thought that was something interesting. While doing research, I ran across quite the idea of good and evil that I think aligns with the Bible, but also aligns with a lot of Eastern understanding of what good and evil is. So let me read it to you. Stated most broadly, this worldview, which is what the author has termed warfare worldview, is that perspective on reality which centers on the conviction that good and evil, fortunate and unfortunate aspects of life are to be interpreted largely as the result of good and evil, friendly or hostile, spirits warring against each other and against us. The central thesis of this work is that the warfare worldview is in one form or another the basic worldview of biblical authors, both the Old Testament and even more so the New. So what does that mean? That means that throughout the biblical account, according to Boyd, that there was this cosmic war going on between good and evil that culminated in what we see the biblical authors writing about. We move on to the next question, which is that of, I might butcher this one too, praxology, or how do we act? How should we act in light of these things? Are these just general principles we should live by, or are they things that should change our lives? In order to answer that question, you have to understand the things above this. And finally, the last thing you will probably want to think about as you're studying this is, what is your epistemology, or what is true and false? How do we obtain knowledge? How do we deal with the aspects we were speaking of earlier today? And how do we characterize the things that we're learning? All of these questions are so important when we are looking to understand our worldview. Again, I am not here today to give you an answer. What I am here to tell you, though, is that until you deep dive and ask these questions, your worldview will not be sturdy. And you need a sturdy worldview so that you can begin to understand where your faith comes in. Some things that I have been chewing on that I think are, you don't have to understand things such as the age of the world in order to maintain a worldview. To me, that's a little bit of an open question. I grew up believing in a creation account that was within 7 actual literal days, and the earth would be about 6,000 to 8,000 years old. However, I also understand that there are other views such as the longer time frames around Earth, and there's good scientific evidence for that. But I don't think that's something that's going to impact my worldview in a way that ruins my faith. Another question I have that does not impact my worldview, but that does partially come to why I said you should hold some things with an open hand, is the question of Calvinism versus Arminianism. I am not an expert on any of these subjects, and I continue to research them. If and when I have more answers, I'll share them. But what I do know is that worldview is important. During my last semester of college, I spent 6 months working on a statement of faith, a personal statement of faith. And maybe at some point I'll go through that with you guys. But what it did was it made me ask myself about, what do I believe about God? What do I believe about the afterlife? What do I believe about the church? What do I believe about all of these things? And how do I back that up? So I would encourage you to write down some questions and slowly work through them. If you're having a hard time finding good resources, I recommend Google Scholar. I recommend talking to a counselor or a pastor. I also recommend YouTube. Now, be careful with YouTube. I know we're on YouTube, but not everything is vetted on YouTube. In fact, you're watching me here today and you don't know me from Adam necessarily, but what you do know is I'm giving you information, and hold that information. Some people that I have found on the YouTube spaces that I've found really helpful in answering some questions are Mike Winger. Another person is Inspiring Philosophy. And if you're struggling with questions on the interaction between Christianity and Islam and how to see the world through those lenses and more of an understanding of a Christian worldview in light of Islamic questions, I recommend someone like David Wood. There are so many other people on YouTube that are great. In a previous video, I linked to Gavin Ortland, and another great person would be Ruslan or Melissa Daughtery. All great people. So go out, ask your questions, see if you can find good resources, but don't be in a hurry. Take your time. There's no rush at this point. God bless. I hope you and your learning and your discovery journey go well, and may you have a wonderful day.